The morning of the auction, there were 900 sick chicks nobody wanted. They sat in the last 3 lots at the back of the cold water sale barn, in flat wire crates, stacked crooked on a pallet, and they made the wrong kind of sound. Not the bright, continuous peeping of a healthy box, but a thin, uneven wheeze that came and went like wind under a door, and their eyes were half shut and crusted, and their down was patchy and damp in places, and they leaned on one another, the way things lean when they have run out of the strength to stand alone. A man from the big hatchery had brought them in and set them down and stepped back from them, and the crowd that drifted past the pallet did what crowds do with a thing that is already dying, which is that it looked once and then looked away, and kept walking toward the pens where the fat straight-run pullets were, the ones with the gloss on them, the ones that would bring a price. The auctioneer knew what he had. He did not build them up. He said the words fast and low. Damaged lot, sold as is, no guarantee, health unknown. And he looked out over the men in their clean caps and their good boots, and he waited for a number, and no number came. And there was a woman, standing at the rail near the back, who had not looked away. She had been looking at them the whole time. Her name was Delia Voss, and she was 44 years old, and she had shoulder-length wavy chestnut hair pushed up under a worn olive ball cap, and freckles the sun had put there, and dirt she had put there herself that morning, and hazel eyes that did not move off the crates, and hands on the top rail that were strong and scarred and still. And when the auctioneer came around a 3rd time and said would anybody give him anything at all, to haul this misery off the floor, Delia Voss said, quiet enough that he had to lean, "I'll take all 3 lots." And a laugh went up before the gavel did. It came mostly from one place, from a broad, prosperous man named Garrett Pyle, who ran the largest broiler operation in 3 counties, and stood with his thumbs in his belt, like a man who had bought and sold more chickens than everyone in that barn put together, which he had. And Garrett Pyle said loud enough for the whole floor, "Well now," and looked around to make sure the floor was with him. And it was. And he said, "Honey, you just bought yourself 900 funerals." And the men laughed with him because it was easy, and because it was probably true, and the auctioneer, who was not a cruel man, only a tired one, brought the gavel down soft, sold, and wrote her number, and it was done. Delia did not answer Garrett Pyle. She did not tell him what she paid, which was almost nothing, or what she meant to do, which she had not fully told herself. She went and settled the ticket, and she backed her old truck up to the loading door, a truck so old and so ill-kept that when it idled it seemed to compose its own obituary, coughing and shuddering, and going quiet and catching again, and she loaded the pallet herself while the men watched, because none of them offered, and she did not ask, and she laid an old moving blanket over the crates against the wind, and she pulled out onto the 2-lane with 900 dying birds breathing their thin, uneven breath behind her, and 40 miles of ridge road ahead. Now before I take you up that road with her, I want to ask you something, and it costs you nothing. If you have ever been the one standing at the back of a room, while everybody laughed at what you could see, and they couldn't, do me a small favor and tap the like button so this story gets carried a little further down its own road, and then tell me in the comments where you're watching from, your town, your city, your country, just the name of the place you call yours, because I read every single one of them, every night, and it means more than you know, to see where these stories land. That's all. Now come up the road. Because there is a thing you should understand about why a grown woman with a certificate she never used, and $1,100 to her name, would bind herself to 900 birds a hatchery had already written off. And the thing is, that she had nowhere else to be. She had come back to the county in April with everything she owned in the bed of that truck, back to the old Voss place her family had let go slack for a decade. Back because a life she had built somewhere flat and bright and far away had come apart in her hands, and this was the one door that had not closed, and she had spent 2 months walking the leaning outbuildings and the grown-over garden and the barn her great-grandfather had built wrong, and she had been waiting, though she could not have told you for what, for a thing that needed her more than she needed a reason. And on the morning of the auction, in 3 crooked crates nobody wanted, She had found it. The Voss place sat at the end of a gravel road that gave up being gravel a quarter-mile before the house, and it climbed a shoulder of ridge into a stand of oak and hickory, and the house itself was a low-weathered farmhouse with a porch that dipped at one corner and a tin roof gone the soft brown of old pennies, and behind it stood the outbuildings her people had raised and left, a spring house, a corn crib, a leaning equipment shed, and the barn. The barn was the thing. Everyone who had ever looked at it had said the same thing, which was that Silas Voss had built it wrong, because it did not face the weather the way barns face the weather, and it sat low and long into the hill, instead of tall and proud off it, and it had a strange run of small shuttered vents down its north wall, and a floor that stepped down in 3 broad shallow terraces toward the back, and the roof came low over deep eaves, so that even in hard sun, the inside of it stayed dim and cool and moving with air, and men had told Delia's grandmother for 50 years that it was a fool's barn, and her grandmother had said nothing back, because her grandmother said perhaps 1/10 of what she thought, and made you earn even that. Delia carried the crates into that barn because it was the only building with a floor she trusted, and she set them down on the lowest terrace where the air moved, and she opened the wire and looked at 900 small dying things, and she did the only thing she knew how to do, which was to make a list. She wrote down what she saw. She wrote wheeze, left more than right, and she wrote crust on the eyes, and she wrote down not standing, count roughly 200, and standing but leaning, count roughly 400, and standing and eating, count fewer than 100. And she did not let herself round the last number up to make it kinder. She had always been a keeper of notes, a woman who wrote down what was in front of her before she let herself feel anything about it, and the habit had cost her friends who wanted her to react, and it had saved her more than once from lying to herself, and she trusted it more than she trusted her own heart. And when the list was done, and the light was going, she climbed the porch of the house where her grandmother sat, the old woman who had held on to this land through everything, by the simple method of refusing to leave it. And Delia said,
"I bought the sick lot at Coldwater, 900.
And her grandmother, whose name was Eva, and who was 89, and wore the same faded work dress she had worn since a decade Delia could not remember, kept her eyes on the yarn in her lap, and shelled out 3 long seconds before she spoke, and then she said only, "In the barn." It was not a question. Delia said yes. And Eva nodded once, a small economical motion, and she said, "That barn was built for the sick ones." And she said nothing after that, and she went back to her knitting, and Delia stood on the porch with those 7 words settling on her, and did not understand them yet, but wrote them down anyway that night. That barn was built for the sick ones, because it was the first thing anyone had said that sounded less like pity and more like a door. She went back down in the dark with a lantern, and she sat on the cold terrace floor among the crates, and she listened to the wheeze come and go, and she counted the ones that had already gone still in the 2 hours since she'd brought them home, and there were 19, and she carried the 19 out into the yard, and she did not name them. She held that line, and she went back in, and she counted again at midnight, and lost 11 more, and she did not name those either. And somewhere around 2 in the morning, with her back against the cool stone of the barn's low north wall, and her lantern turned down to a coal, she asked out loud, "To the barn, or to Silas, or to nobody? What did you build you for?" And the barn did not answer, because barns don't. But the question stayed with her. And in the grey of the next morning, moving warm mash under the beaks of the ones that would still take it, she remembered a thing she had passed 100 times and never opened, and she went looking for it before she let herself sleep. What she went looking for was in the corn crib, in a tin trunk under 3 generations of broken harness and a rolled square of tent canvas gone stiff with age, a trunk she had noticed her first week home and had meant to get to, and had not, and she dragged it out into the light and worked the rusted hasp with a screwdriver until it gave, and inside, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a length of waxed cord, was a stack of ledgers. 6 of them, bound in cracked black board, and a bundle of loose procedure sheets, and a folded square of paper tucked into the first ledger's cover that she did not open yet because the ledgers themselves stopped her breath. They were her great-grandfather's. Silas Voss had written in a small upright hand that never hurried, and he had dated everything, and the earliest date was 1931, and the ledgers were not accounts of money, or not mostly. They were accounts of birds. Page after page after page of birds. He had kept flocks his whole life, and he had kept them through the years when the county's other men were tearing out their yard flocks and buying into the new fast strains that grew to weight in 8 weeks and came from a catalogue. And Silas had written, in a line she found on the 3rd page and read 4 times, "The strong ones die first." She did not know what it meant. She read on. He wrote about the barn, about why he had stepped the floor and cut the north vents and set the eaves low, and he wrote a sentence she copied into her own book that night. "Air that moves and does not chill is the whole of it. The rest is patience." He wrote about sickness, about the running of the eyes and the wet in the chest, and he did not write about curing it. He wrote about keeping through it. And there was a difference, and she felt the difference before she could name it. He wrote, "You do not cure a bird. You keep a bird slow and warm and dry and fed light, and you let the weak thing in it die, and the strong thing in it wake, and the ones that come up out of it come up hard, and those are the ones. Those are the ones." She read it, and she looked down the dim length of the barn at the crates of leaning, wheezing chicks she had paid almost nothing for, because a hatchery could not keep them, and a sale yard could not sell them. And she understood, or began to, that she had not bought 900 funerals. She had bought 900 arguments, and Silas Voss had written the case for the defense 40 years before she was born. She read until the lantern guttered, and she slept 4 hours on the terrace floor, with a ledger open on her chest, and she woke to the wheeze, quieter than the night before, or maybe only quieter to her now, and she started to work the way the book told her to work. She did not force-feed. She warmed the mash and thinned it and set it low, and let them come. She did not crowd them under one lamp. She spread the heat the length of the terrace, so the strong ones did not pile the weak ones into a corner and smother them, which the book had warned of in a line she underlined twice. Crowding kills more than cold. She kept the north vents cracked so the air crept through and carried the wet breath out, and did not let it hang, and she learned within 3 days to read the barn the way Silas had built it to be read, to stand at the low end and feel whether the air was moving, and to know by the smell whether the wet was leaving or gathering. And she counted every morning and every night, and she wrote the counts down, and she did not lie about them. In the first week, she lost 240 birds, and it was a slaughter, and it broke something in her that she did not let show, and she carried them out by lantern light, and she did not name them. And then in the second week she lost 60, and in the third week she lost 9, and in the fourth week she lost none, and she sat on the terrace on the last night of the fourth week, and listened, and the sound in the barn had changed all the way over, from that thin, uneven wheeze, to something low and even and content. 600 and some birds breathing warm in the dark. And she wrote in her book, the barn was built for the sick ones, and under it she wrote, he was right. And she went up to the house, and stood in the door of her grandmother's room and said, I stopped losing them. And Iva, who did not open her eyes, said, I know. And that was all, and it was enough. Word of it started the way everything started in that county, through a woman named Loretta, who ran the counter at the feed store on the county road, and who knew the business of every farm within 30 miles the way a heart knows the body it beats for. Because everyone had to come to her for scratch and layer pellets and salt and twine, and everyone talked while she rang them up, and she carried what she heard out the door in the next man's ear. Delia had to buy feed, and so Delia came to Loretta, and the first time she came, Loretta looked her over and said, You're the one bought the dead lot at Coldwater. And Delia said, They're not all dead. And Loretta said, How many? And Delia, who did not lie even to be kind to herself, said, 630 as of this morning. and Loretta's hand stopped on the register. Because 630 out of 900 sick chicks was not a number that happened. It was not a number the hatchery could have made, and the hatchery had all the medicine and all the lamps and all the college men. And Loretta, who understood the value of a thing that shouldn't be possible, said it out loud to the next man through the door, and he said it to the men at the co-op. And inside a week, the county knew that the Voss woman had kept 2 birds out of every 3, from a lot that was supposed to keep none. And the county did what counties do, which was to decide she'd gotten lucky, and to say so, and the loudest saying so came again from Garrett Pyle, who heard the number at the co-op counter, and said, "Luck, that's all that is. You can't keep sick birds. Everybody knows you can't keep sick birds. You cull sick birds or you lose the whole house." And he said it with the weight of a man who ran 40,000 birds under one long metal roof, and had the loans and the trucks and the contracts to prove it. And he said, "She'll bury that flock by fall. Mark it. Those birds are weak, and weak birds are dead birds walking, and I'd not eat an egg off that place if you paid me." And that got carried back to Delia too, through Loretta, who told her not to hurt her, but because Loretta believed in fair warning. And Delia listened to all of it, standing at the counter with a sack of pellets on her shoulder. And when Loretta finished, Delia set the sack in the truck and came back in and said only, "That's one approach," and left. And Loretta laughed for a full minute after the door shut, not at her, but at the flatness of it, and told that too, and it went around, "That's one approach," and it made people like her a little without their meaning to. Garrett Pyle's prophecy about the fall she wrote down in her book that night, word for word as Loretta had given it. She'll bury that flock by fall, and beside it she wrote the line from Silas she could not stop returning to, "The strong ones die first." And she looked at the 2 lines sitting next to each other on the page, and she had the strange sure feeling that they were about the same thing, and pointed opposite ways, and she did not know yet how, but she wrote under both of them, "We will see," and she closed the book. And the flock came up hard, just as the ledger said it would, and by high summer, the 600 and some birds that had come up out of that sickness were not weak at all. They were the tightest, brightest, most watchful flock anyone had seen, lean and quick and hardy, with a gloss on them that the fat catalogue birds never carried. And they ranged the stepped terraces and the grown-over orchard, and they ate half of what a confinement bird ate. And they laid, when the pullets came in to lay in the last week of August, a first egg that Delia found on the low windowsill of the barn, where a hen had gone to be alone. One brown egg, warm in the morning light. And she stood and looked at it a long time before she touched it, and then she carried it up to the house in 2 hands, like it was the only one in the world, and she set it on the table in front of her grandmother. And Iva looked at it, and looked at Delia, and said, "Silas's line," and picked it up, and felt the weight of it, and set it down, and went back to her peas. And Delia understood that she had just been paid the highest compliment the old woman had in her, and she wrote in her book that night, "First egg, August 31st, and she did not write anything about how it made her feel, because some things she kept even from the book. The eggs did what the survival had not quite done, which was to make the thing real to people who needed to hold it in their hands. Because a flock that lives is a rumor, but an egg is a fact, and these eggs were facts of a kind the county had forgotten, with shells so hard you had to mean it to crack them, and yolks that stood up orange and domed in the pan, and did not run flat and pale the way store eggs ran. And Delia had more of them than one woman and one old grandmother could eat, so she started carrying them to the feed store in flats, and leaving them with Loretta on consignment. And Loretta sold them off the counter faster than she could shelve them. And then a man who cooked at the inn down in the valley, a lean, quiet cook named Antoine, who had trained in cities and come home to the ridge for reasons he did not explain, drove up the gravel one afternoon because he had cracked one of those eggs into a pan at the inn and stood still over it. And he found Delia in the barn, and he did not talk about business. He asked to see the birds, and she showed him, and he watched them range for a while, and he crouched and looked at how they moved, and he said, "These aren't stressed." And she said, "No." And he said, I can taste stress in an egg. Most eggs I get taste like fear. These don't. And she wrote that down later too. Most eggs taste like fear. Because it was the truest thing a stranger had said on that place. And Antoine bought every egg she could bring him, and asked for more than she could bring. And he told the other cooks in the valley, the way one craftsman tells another, quietly, without advertising, this is where the eggs come from. And the word went out along that channel, the channel of people who work with their hands, and recognize good work when it is set in front of them. And it went further and faster than any sign on the county road could have carried it. And by the first cold of the year, Delia had a waiting list she had never asked for and a reputation she had never claimed. And she still drove the same coughing truck and wore the same faded flannel and kept the same book. And a hatchery man came up the road that fall, not Garrett Pyle's operation, but the small independent hatchery 2 counties over. An old man named Ferris, who had spent 50 years hatching chicks and had a feel for a bird the way a driller has a feel for water. And he had heard what she kept, and he did not believe it, and he came to see. And he walked the terraces with her in silence. And he picked up a hen and turned it in his hands and spread a wing and looked in an eye and felt the keel and set the hen down and picked up another and did the whole thing again. And then he stood a while, and then he said, "Where'd you learn to keep like this?" And Delia said, "My great-grandfather wrote it down." And Ferris said, "Silas Voss." And she said, "You knew him." And Ferris said, "My daddy knew him. My daddy said Silas Voss was the only man in this country who understood that you breed hardiness by nearly losing it. Everybody else bred it out, chasing weight." And Ferris looked down the barn and said, half to himself, "He built the wrong barn on purpose, didn't he?" And Delia said, "That's what I'm learning." And Ferris nodded and left. And word that Ferris the hatchery man had walked the Voss place and pronounced it sound went around the county in a day. Because Ferris did not praise, and Ferris had not made a large production out of it. He had only said what was so, and that carried. And Garrett Pyle heard that too, and Garrett Pyle said less about it than he had said before. And Loretta noticed, and told Delia so. "He's quiet on you lately." And Delia said nothing, and inside, she kept the counsel of the book, which was to grow no faster than the work could bear. And when a man from the regional co-op came around in December and offered to finance her into a real laying operation, 6 long houses and 10,000 hens and a truck of her own, and a contract, all of it on terms, all of it on debt, Delia listened politely and thanked him and said no. And the co-op man could not understand it, and asked why. And Delia gave him the only answer she had, which was another line out of Silas Voss that she had come to live by. And she said, "Debt is a man telling the future what it has to do, and I don't know the future well enough to boss it." And the co-op man left shaking his head, and Ivor, who had heard the whole thing from the porch, said one word, "Good," and knitted on. The winter was the first hard test the book had promised, and it came the way the book had said it would come, slow, and then all at once. And Delia kept the flock through it, the way Silas had written that you keep a flock through cold, which was not by fighting the cold, but by respecting it, by trusting the low barn, and the moving air, and the deep bedding that composted its own faint warmth from underneath, by feeding heavier through the short days, and cracking the vents against the wet, even when every instinct screamed to seal the birds up tight, because the book said in a line she had underlined 3 times, "The killer in winter is not the cold, it is the damp breath with nowhere to go. Seal them tight, and you drown them in their own weather." And the men who ran the modern houses did the opposite. They sealed and heated and ran fans and burned propane, and most of them came through fine, because money can buy its way past a lot of hard weather, and Garrett Pyle's 40,000 birds came through the cold in their climate-controlled house without losing a feather, and Delia's flock came through it too, quieter and cheaper and harder, and if the story had ended at winter, it would have been only the story of a woman who did an old thing well. But the story did not end at winter. The story turned in the second spring, in the wet, warm week of the 2nd April, when the sickness came into the county. It came the way it always came, quiet and unannounced, carried on a truck tire, or a boot, or the wing of a wild bird off the flyway. And it went first into a small flock down in the valley, and then into a larger one, and then it was everywhere at once. And it was not the ordinary running-eye sickness Delia had bought her chicks out of. It was the other kind. The fast kind. The kind that came with a name that made the state men put on white suits, and it moved through a confinement house like fire through dry grass, 40,000 birds breathing the same sealed air. And when it went into a house like that, it did not leave survivors. It left silence. And that spring, the county learned what silence sounds like. Because a laying house, or a broiler house that has taken the fast sickness, goes quiet in a matter of days, the sound of it drops and drops until one morning a man walks out to his long metal building, and there is no sound at all coming from under that roof. None. 40,000 birds and not one voice. And it is a sound that men who heard it that spring said they would hear the rest of their lives. And the state men came in their white suits and they did what has to be done. And one operation after another was emptied and buried and burned. And the trucks ran day and night. And Garrett Pyle's great house took the sickness in the 3rd week of April, and Garrett Pyle stood in his own yard and listened to his life go quiet under that roof, and could do nothing. And they buried his 40,000 birds in a trench with a machine, and he was not a young man, and he had a great deal owed against those birds, against the houses and the trucks and the feed, and the future he had told what to do with all that borrowed money, came due all at once, and told him what it had really meant. And up on the ridge, at the end of the gravel that gave out before the house, in a low, wrong-built barn that breathed its own moving air, in a flock of hard, lean birds that had come up out of sickness as chicks, and carried in them the thing Silas Voss had spent his life keeping alive, a thing the catalogue men had bred out chasing weight, and Silas had bred in by nearly losing it. The sickness came and touched the Voss flock, and did not take it. It touched it. Delia lost birds that spring. She wrote every one of them down, 41 over 3 weeks, and she grieved them in her flat, unshowing way. But the sickness did not run through her flock like fire. It moved through them slow, and it met in bird after bird a hardiness the fast catalogue strains had never had, the deep old resistance of a line that had survived being sick. And the flock closed around its losses and held, and on the morning the last new death came, and no other followed, Delia stood at the low end of the barn and listened, and her barn was full of sound, 600 voices and more, low and even and alive, on a morning when every other roof for 20 miles had gone silent. And she understood at last what Silas had meant, and she took out her book and turned to the page where 2 lines sat side by side. And beside Garrett Pyle's prophecy, she'll bury that flock by fall, and beside Silas Voss's line, the strong ones die first, she wrote the date, and she wrote, they were the same thing after all, and she closed the book and went out and did the chores, because the chores did not stop for being right. The reckoning after did not come as a single scene, and Delia would not have wanted it to, because she was not a woman who needed a stage. It came slow, over the summer, in 100 small corrections, as the county worked its own judgment, over in its hands, the way a man works a stone he has picked up out of a field, and finds is not a stone at all. Loretta at the feed store watched the flats of Voss eggs go from a curiosity on the corner of her counter to the only eggs anyone in 3 townships wanted, because in a spring, when nearly every flock in the county had been buried or burned, the Voss flock had lived, and people wanted more than eggs from a flock like that. They wanted the flock itself. They wanted chicks. They wanted the line. They came up the gravel road asking, and Delia sold them a few and told them plainly it would not work the way they wanted, that you could not just buy the birds, that the birds were only half of it, and the barn and the book and the patience were the other half, and most of them did not want to hear that. Because most people never do. They want the thing and not the years, and some of them went away disappointed and said she was holding back a secret, and she was not holding back a secret. She had told them the whole of it, and it was only that the whole of it was harder than a secret. But a few of them heard it and stayed to learn, and one of those was a boy. And before the boy, though, there was Garrett Pyle, because a man like Garrett Pyle could not simply fade. The county would not have let him, and something in him would not have let him either. And so in the deep of that summer, Garrett Pyle drove his good truck up the bad gravel to the end where it gives out, and he got down out of it slow. An older man now than he had been at the auction, a man with an empty metal house behind him and a debt in front of him and something taken out of his walk, and he stood in the yard, and Delia came out of the barn wiping her hands and did not help him and did not gloat. She just waited, because she had learned waiting from the best waiter in the county, who was sitting on the porch behind her with yarn in her lap. And Garrett Pyle looked at the barn and looked at the flock ranging the terraces bright and alive, and he took off his cap, which was a thing that meant something in that country, and he said, "I came to say I was wrong." He did not dress it up. He did not explain himself or blame the sickness or the flyway or his luck. He did not make a large production out of it. He said the 4 words a proud man finds hardest, and then he stood there holding his cap. And Delia looked at him a while, and then she did the thing that made Loretta cry when she heard it later. She did not say, "I told you so," and she did not say, "It's all right" either, because it was not all right. 40,000 birds were in a trench. She said only, "You kept them the way you were taught, and somebody taught me different. That's the whole difference. Come see how." And she turned and walked into the barn, and after a moment, Garrett Pyle put his cap back on and followed her in, and she spent an hour showing a broken man how her great-grandfather had built a barn to breathe and keep a bird slow. And Garrett Pyle listened the way a man listens when listening is the only thing he has left. And when he left, he shook her hand, and he did not say much. And what he had come up the hill carrying, he did not carry back down. And that was the conversion. Ceremonieless, the way the true ones are. And the county heard about it, of course, through Loretta, that Garrett Pyle had taken off his cap in the Voss yard and said he was wrong, and the hearing of it finished the turn the sickness had started. And after that summer, nobody in that county laughed at the woman who bought the sick chicks. And the strange thing, the thing Delia noted in her book without comment, was that being right had not felt the way she had thought it would feel back on the cold terrace floor at 2 in the morning. It had not felt like triumph. It had felt like something older and quieter than triumph, like a debt being paid to a man who had been in the ground since before she was born, and she found she could not enjoy it as her own, because it had never really been her own. She had only kept it. The way Silas said, she had only kept the thing slow and warm until the strong part of it woke, and now it was awake, and it was not hers. It was the line's, and it would need somewhere to go after her, the way it had needed somewhere to go after him, and she began, that summer, to watch for where. Where it went to began with the boy, and the boy came the way the best things came on that place, unasked and half-noticed. And it was Ivor who noticed him first, because Ivor noticed everything and said 1/10 of it. He was a valley boy named Cole, 14 that summer, a quiet, undersized boy from a family that had lost its own small flock to the sickness in April, and he had started coming up the gravel road on a bicycle too big for him, 3 miles up from the valley and 3 miles back, and at first he only stood at the fence line and watched the birds, and Delia let him stand, because she had once been a woman who stood at a rail and watched a thing nobody else could see, and she knew better than to chase off a watcher. And after a week of watching, he asked, over the fence, could he help? And Delia, who had learned from the book to treat a willing pair of hands as already capable, said, "There's a fork by the north door," and did not thank him, and did not fuss over him. She just made room. And the boy took the fork and mucked the low terrace like he had done it his whole life, quiet and thorough. And he came back the next day and the next, and he had a way with the birds that Delia recognized, because she had it too, a stillness that made them not fear him. And one evening late in the summer, Eva watched him from the porch, a long time as he moved down the terraces, closing the birds in for the night, unhurried, sure, and Eva said, out of a silence that had lasted an hour, That one has the hands. And Delia looked, and knew she was right, the way she was always right, and she said nothing, but she started, from that evening, to teach the boy on purpose, to show him the vents and the air, and the deep bedding, and the light feeding. And one afternoon she brought the ledgers out to the barn and set them in front of him, and let him read Silas Voss's small upright hand, and the boy read the line, "The strong ones die first," and looked up, and Delia said, "You'll understand it before you're my age, sooner than I did." And the boy bent back over the book, and it was around then that Iva began to fail. She failed the way she had lived, without complaint and without much announcement. She simply grew quieter and slower and sat longer over the same short row of knitting. And Delia moved a cot into her room and sat with her in the evenings and did not fill the silence because Iva had never wanted it filled. And one warm night at the very end of summer, Eva said, more words at once than she had spent in a month. She said, "The barn's yours now, and the book, and the boy when he's ready." And she paused and worked one more stitch and said, "Silas would have liked you. He was the same as you. He'd tell you a truth and let you make of it what you would." And then she said, "In the corn crib trunk there's a folded paper I never opened. It was his. It's got your name business on it more than mine. You'll know when." And Delia said, "Know when what?" And Iva only smiled a very little and did not answer, because Eva said a tenth of what she thought, and she had reached her 10th, and she closed her eyes, and a few mornings later, on a cool, clear dawn with the barn already loud with living birds, Eva Voss died in her sleep, in the room she had refused to leave for 60 years, and Delia found her still and peaceful, and did not weep at once. She sat with her a long while first, and then she went out and did the chores, because the chores did not stop, and the birds had to be let out into the light, whether or not the woman who had held the land through everything was still in it. And that was the hardest thing Delia had ever done, letting the birds out into an ordinary morning on the day the world had changed. And she did it, and she wrote in her book only 3 words that night, Iva, at dawn, and could write no more. They buried Iva Voss in the family plot on the shoulder of the ridge above the wrong-built barn, on a bright, hard afternoon in early September, and the whole county came, which told Delia something she had not fully known until she stood at the graveside and watched the road fill with trucks, because a county tells you what it thinks of a family by who comes to put its elder in the ground. And they came, all of them, and Delia stood at the head of the grave in her one clean shirt, and watched them come, and named them to herself as they arrived, which was the closest she came to weeping, Loretta from the feed store, with her eyes already red, and Ferris, the old hatchery man, who had driven 2 counties over, to stand in the sun for a woman he had barely known, because he had known what she came from, and Antoine the cook, who had closed the inn's kitchen for the afternoon, and brought a wreath of dried herbs and wildflowers, because he did not have the words but had that, and the co-op man she had told no to, standing at the back with his hat in his hands, and the boy Cole, with his whole quiet family, and last and not least, Garrett Pyle, in a black coat, standing where a year before he could not have imagined standing, and when the words were said and the first earth was turned, it was Garrett Pyle who stepped up unbidden and took a turn with the shovel, an old, prosperous, ruined man, doing the plain hard work of covering a neighbor, and he did not make a production of it, and Delia watched him and understood that the county had corrected its whole judgment, of Iva and of Silas and of her, and that the correction was not in any words anyone said, but in the simple fact of all these people, standing on this ridge on a workday afternoon, and she carried that home with her more than she carried the grief. Or rather, she carried them folded together, the grief and the vindication bound so tight she could not have pulled them apart, because the ones who would have been proudest to see the flock live through the silence, Eva, who had said, "I know before there was anything to know," and Silas, who had written the whole thing down in a language of vents and air and patience, 40 years before it was needed, neither of them was there to see it, and that was the shape of it. That was the true shape of every earned thing, that the proof always comes a little too late for the ones who most deserved to watch it come. And that night, alone in the house for the first time in her life, with the barn breathing its low, even breath down the hill, Delia remembered the folded paper Iva had spoken of, and she went out to the corn crib with a lantern and opened the tin trunk and found it in the cover of the first ledger, where it had been all along. The paper she had not opened on the very first night, because the ledgers had stopped her breath, and she unfolded it now, and it was in Silas Voss's small, upright hand, and it was addressed, impossibly, to no name and to every name. It said only, at the top, to whoever keeps them next, and below that a few lines, and at the very bottom, underlined twice, 2 words, and the 2 words were, keep them. And she understood that this was the open thing at last resolved, the instruction planted before she was born, and waiting in a trunk for whoever came home with nowhere else to be, and eyes that would not look away. Keep them, not raise them, not grow them, not sell them, keep them, the way you keep a promise, the way you keep faith, the way you keep a thing alive that the world has decided is worth nothing until the world corrects itself. And she folded the paper back along its old creases, and she did not weep even then. She went and stood in the door of the barn in the dark, and listened to the sound of 600 and more living birds, who should, by every account of every man at that sale yard, have been 900 funerals. And she said, out loud, to Silas and to Iva and to the barn, I'll keep them. And it was a vow, and she wrote it in the book as a vow, and it was enough, and she slept. The years after moved faster, the way years do once a thing is proven, and they can be told faster, the way the ledger itself grew terser as Silas aged and grew sure. In the 3rd year, Delia grew the flock, but only as fast as the work could bear, which was the only speed she trusted, and she turned down again a bigger offer and a smaller one, and kept to her own scale. And the boy Cole grew into the work, until there was no chore on the place. He could not do better than she could, and she paid him a real wage from the first, and treated his hands as capable, because they were. And by the 4th year, he was less a helper than a partner, and the 2 of them kept the line going, hatching each spring from the hardiest of the survivors, just as Silas had written, breeding for the thing you can only get by nearly losing it, and the flock stayed hard and bright, and the eggs stayed hard-shelled and orange-yolked, and the cooks in the valley kept driving up the gravel, and the people who wanted the shortcut kept driving up too, and kept going away, told the same true hard thing, that the birds were only half of it. And Garrett Pyle, who did not rebuild his great sealed house because the debt of it had taught him something, the sickness only finished, came up the ridge more than once those years, and he and Cole put up, on the far side of the orchard, a second low barn built the wrong way on purpose, stepped floor and north vents and low deep eaves, built off the drawings in Silas Voss's ledger, and it was a strange thing to see the man who had laughed loudest at the auction driving the nails into a barn designed to breathe. But he did it, and he did not make a production of it, and when it was framed he stood back and looked at it, and said to Delia, he really did build it wrong on purpose, didn't he? And Delia said, he built it right, we just called it wrong for 50 years, and Garrett Pyle nodded and picked up his hammer, and the sickness came back through the county twice more in those years, the way it does, on the flyway in the wet, warm weeks of spring, and twice more the modern houses that had rebuilt went quiet under their long roofs, and twice more the Voss flock, and now the second flock in the second breathing barn, met it slow and held, and after the second time, nobody in that country called it luck anymore, they called it the Voss way, and young farmers came from further off to learn it, and Delia taught any of them who would stay long enough to hear the hard part, and she kept the book going, and she taught Cole to keep a book of his own, because she said, and she meant it, that the birds live because somebody wrote it down, that Silas had beaten death not by curing a single bird, but by keeping a record, and that a thing written down and handed on outlives the hands that wrote it, and that this, more than any egg or any bird, was the real inheritance, the knowing, passed forward. And on a bright, hard morning in the 5th spring, At the cold water sail barn, there was a lot of sick chicks at the back that nobody wanted, thin and wheezing and leaning on one another under the harsh light, while the crowd drifted past toward the glossy pullets, and the auctioneer went around twice and got no number, and there was a young man standing at the back rail who had not looked away, a lean, quiet young man of 19, with sure hands and a worn cap. And when the auctioneer asked would anybody give anything at all, Cole raised his hand and said, "I'll take the lot," and a few people laughed the easy laugh, though fewer than had laughed once, because some of them knew that cap and that stillness, and knew what ridge that boy farmed. And Delia stood beside him and did not say a word, and let him carry the crates to the truck himself, the same coughing truck, older now, and still composing its own obituary at every stoplight, and they drove the 40 miles of Ridge Road home with a load of dying birds breathing their thin, uneven breath behind them, and they carried them into the low barn that breathed, and Cole opened his own book to a clean first page, and began, in a small upright hand he had learned from a hand that had learned it from a page, to write down what he saw. And Delia stood at the low end of the barn, where the air moved, and listened to the wheeze come and go, and knew it would change, in a week, in a month, over into that low, even sound of things that had decided to live. And she thought of Silas, whom she had never met, and Ivor, who had said, "I know," and she felt the weight of it settle onto the boy's shoulders the way a coat settles, and she was not sad, or not only sad, she was something older and quieter than that, and she said to him the line that was his now to carry. "Those are the ones," and he did not look up from his book. He only said, "I know," and it was enough. So if this story has stayed with you, do one thing for me before you go. Share it with someone you know who was told that the thing they love, or the thing they came from, or the thing they are, is worth nothing. Someone the world laughed at and looked away from, because they may need to hear that the world has a way of correcting itself if you can outlast it. And then tell me in the comments about the stubborn thing in your own life, the thing people laughed at you for keeping, the thing you would not let go of no matter how they mocked it, because I read every one, and because somewhere out there is a barn everybody says is built wrong, and a person standing quiet at the back of the room, seeing what nobody else can see, and I would like to think this story finds them and tells them to keep it.